Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This is not a click your fingers moment when suddenly things will snap back to normal. And moving safely into a different looking world depends on all of us still respecting the government's keep your distance rules. But could that be more complicated after the last few torrid days?
There was an outcry when it was revealed that the Prime Minister's top advisor travelled from London to Durham and made a 60-mile separate journey out of lockdown to the town of Barnard Castle. The police said today they would have told Dominic Cummings to go back to his family home if they had stopped him that day, concluding there might have been a minor breach of the rules.
If one of your most senior team wasn't paying proper attention to the rules, why should anyone else? And to the doctors, if I may, is that the kind of example that you want people to follow?
Durham police said was that they were going to take no action and that the matter was closed, and I intend to draw a line under the matter. You've asked Chris and Patrick, but I'm going to interpose myself, if I may, and protect them from what I think would be an unfair and unnecessary attempt to ask a political question. It's very, very important that our medical officers and scientific advisors do not get dragged into what I think most people will recognise is fundamentally a political argument.
But the pressure on the Prime Minister won't disappear.
Nobody should be stopped from answering questions from journalists, but it's the Prime Minister here that's in issue. He's been too weak throughout this whole episode. He should have acted swiftly. If I'd been Prime Minister, I'd have sacked Dominic Cummings. We've now effectively wasted a week when we should have been concentrating on the safety of what comes next.
Political dramas pale, of course, next to the loss felt by so many and the true effects on the country that are emerging piece by piece.
And we can talk to Laura, who's in Westminster. Laura, we heard there the Prime Minister quoting the Durham police in trying to bring this whole Cummings affair, if I can call it that, to a close. Is it?
Well, you could see from that press conference that the Prime Minister just now doesn't want to touch this with a barge pole. He just wants to move on and forget about the episode. And Durham Police, though, did say if they had found Mr Cummings on that journey to the town of Barnard Castle, that they would have told him to go home. But it's also important to note what they also didn't say was that there was a problem with his initial trip from London up to his family property in Durham to get childcare. So they said there might have been a minor breach, but on that sort of central allegation, they didn't say that he had done anything wrong. And, you know, that in Downing Street, they are desperately hoping that politicians and members of the public, despite the huge outrage, are starting to tire of this issue, as it has been carrying on for such a long time. But opposition politicians have got a bit between their teeth. They don't want to let this drop. Many Tory MPs are still really cross about it behind the scenes. And I think that in the longer term, Downing Street hopes it won't be a problem, but it has really opened up some fractures in terms of their own party. And many people watching tonight might still be pretty cross about it.
And Laura, in your report, you pointed out that this easing of the lockdown, it still needs public cooperation.
It does, and that's why what we were just talking about is so important. For the next phase to work, swathes of the public, the vast majority of us, have to put our faith in the government. And I think inside government there's an acute awareness that there were some issues at the beginning of this. Despite huge levels of public compliance, the government had problems, whether it was over having enough kit for medics, whether it was over increasing testing quickly enough, whether it was, of course, over the terrible death toll that there's actually been. And I think they're acutely conscious that this next much more complicated phase of moving out of the lockdown is absolutely vital to try to get right. But remember, we've inched out of this. The next week will be maybe moving out of it a few feet, but the final emergence from lockdown into something else will be a journey of many miles.
Laura, thank you very much.
Now, millions of families and friends kept apart by the breakdown and by the lockdown will be able to meet again from Monday. Boris Johnson said that the change in the rules for England would be a long-awaited, joyful moment for many. But the Prime Minister also faced more questions about Dominic Cummings after Durham police said he might have committed a, quote, minor breach of lockdown rules by taking a 50-mile drive to test his eyesight. Mr Johnson said he wanted to draw a line under the matter. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster.
Well, that statement from Durham Police today will have disappointed the critics of Dominic Cummings' recent behaviour, but it means that people around the Prime Minister tonight are beginning to dare to hope that this is perhaps the end of that particular saga. They think there's a chance here to break the chain, as they see it, the cycle. They think that MPs saying that Dominic Cummings should go keeps the whole story in the headlines and feeds constituents of other MPs to nag them, pester other MPs to themselves put out another statement. And they want to break that chain, as it were, and they think they now have a chance. What impact all of this is actually having on public health, of course, is an unknown. And this was a very big day on public health because we had the government formally launching the test and trace programme in England, even if it isn't probably by common admission fully ready. And we also have them announcing this surprise new bonus freedom about meeting people in your garden or in the open space as long as you're maintaining social distancing. That came as a bit of a surprise, and there was a real sense in the press conference that Boris Johnson was the man in government who, as much as anybody, strains at the leash to try and push the relaxation all the time, return your freedoms to you and change the subject.
I believe that in all the circumstances I behaved reasonably and legally.
As far as I can see, he stuck to the rules and he acted legally.
Durham police aren't quite so sure. Although they say driving to Durham during lockdown was within the regulations, they think the hour-round trip to Barnard Castle might have been a minor breach of the regulations that would have warranted police intervention. The statement goes on, had a Durham constabulary police officer stopped Mr Cummings driving to or from Barnard Castle, the officer would have spoken to him and, having established the facts, likely advised Mr Cummings to return to the address in Durham.
I also noticed that the Durham police said was that they were going to take no action and that the matter was closed, and I intend to draw a line under the matter as I...
Journalists longing to ask the science advisors at his side what they made of Dominic Cummings' behaviour were warded off.
I'm going to interpose myself, if I may, and protect them from what I think would be an unfair and unnecessary attempt to ask a political question. It's very, very...
The Prime Minister wanted attention on what he knows will be a longed-for relaxation of lockdown in England. It starts from Monday.
We will allow up to 6 people to meet outside, provided those from different households continue strictly to observe social distancing rules. So, we will now allow people to meet in gardens and other private outdoor spaces. These changes mean that friends and family can start to meet their loved ones, perhaps seeing both parents at once or both grandparents at once. And I know that for many people this will be a long-awaited and joyful moment. And it remains the case that people should not be inside the homes of their friends and families, not inside the homes of your friends and families, unless it is to access the garden, to get to the garden.
Test and trace works because it allows localised patterns of infection to be detected and contained.
The government also formally kicked off its test and trace programme, which targets lockdown on individuals who are at risk of having COVID-19 and who'll be told they must stay home.
Yes, you must self-isolate, and I know that is going to be hard and it is going to be difficult for people, but do not forget that this is the way to beat it.
If you test positive for COVID-19 now, you should get a call, a text or an email alert within 24 hours, which will tell you to go online and share names and contact details of people you've been close to in the last 48 hours. That means people you were 2 metres away from for 15 minutes or more, or people you were closer to for an even briefer period of time. Those people will then get an alert telling them to self-isolate at home for 14 days from the moment of contact with the COVID sufferer. Even if you test negative, you must still stay locked in.
Well, as long as my wages were paid, then I guess I stay at home.
I think personally I would, just completely obey it, really. I mean, you know, we're in such a terrible situation that I can't see that there's any other way around it.
I think now there's more and more people here because of Dominic Cummings. Now he's just saying, well, there's a rule for me and there's a rule for everybody else. I can do what I want. But you see now people, and I talk to people now around here, and they're saying, well, if Dominic Cummings can do it, so can I.
From Friday, Scotland will follow many of the loosenings of restrictions which came into effect in England 2 weeks ago. There too, people will be allowed to go to meet other households in a garden with a cap of 8 in the group.
We are not putting a legal limit on how far you can travel to meet another household, but please use your good judgment. If the distance is so far that you would have to use someone else's bathroom, then perhaps you shouldn't be doing it.
An NHS England test and trace call centre starting its work today. With no phone app working alongside it and some tracers complaining of technical glitches, it's running to keep up with an easing of the shutdown that edges forward again on Monday.
Gary Gibbon, well, we asked the government for an interview and we also invited more than 50 Conservative MPs individually, but no one was available. Earlier, I spoke to Professor of Global Public Health at Edinburgh, Devi Sridhar, and I began by asking whether the Prime Minister's 5 tests for starting to lift lockdown are being met.
Well, no, I think actually these are all subject to interpretation. So one of the areas that is a bit concerning today from the new ONS survey results is that there's close to 1,000 new infections still occurring, and this has been during lockdown. So to have a testing and tracing system and hoping this could take over at this level of infection, it's quite going to be a big ask right now. So would you say that this judgment that the 5 tests are being met is a scientific judgment or a political judgment? I think right now it's a political judgment. I think also, for example, the test around, is there adequate testing, is there adequate PPE? These are, I guess, subject to interpretation. Ideally, if you look like a country like Germany, they're testing teachers, they're testing students. We clearly don't have capacity in the UK for that level yet. Do we have enough capacity to test second-order contacts? That means when someone is, told they're exposed, it's not clear we'll be able to test them either.
Now, the other really interesting and puzzling information that came out today from the ONS was that their survey suggests that over 2/3 of people who've had the virus were asymptomatic. Does this mean that a lot more of us have had the virus than we currently think?
Well, I guess there's 2 ways to read it. So the first thing is probably these people are pre-symptomatic. That means that they're not yet having symptoms. They have the virus, but they will be in the next 4 to 5 days. The second point on, does it say that actually the iceberg is larger? Well, we also found out in the ONS survey today that actually the iceberg is not that much larger. There were hopes that 20 to 30% of the population could have been exposed. And actually, it's not. The numbers that came back look to be between 6 and 7%, which is in line with what you've seen with France, with Sweden, with parts of the US that have tested, which means a very small percentage of the country have actually been exposed to this virus so far. And it means the outbreak still has a long way to go if it's not contained quickly.
Now, at the daily press conference today, Boris Johnson did something quite astonishing in that he stopped the chief scientist and the medical advisor from answering questions from the press on what they thought of Dominic Cummings' behaviour and whether it set a good example to the public, saying it was a political question. Is this a political question, or is it more than that?
I don't see this as a political question. It's a question around trying to get the trust of the public to comply with pretty drastic measures for the next few weeks, few months, until we have a better solution. And so it seems like the actions of the government are undermining itself. They're trying right now to carry a government and carry a public, but actually let's think, what are the principles of good governance? The principles of good governance are fairness, transparency, honesty, solidarity, and right now I think the government is struggling.
Devi Sridhar, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it's worth adding that Downing Street is now clarifying their version of what happened, which is that the Prime Minister's advisors, the Chief Scientific Officer and the Chief Medical Officer, were free to answer those questions about Dominic Cummings when they were asked about it by journalists later. So now, how is the news that there is to be no further action against Mr. Cummings going down in Barnard Castle, the town he said he drove to merely to test his eyesight? Our correspondent, Kieran Jenkins, is right there now. Kieran.
Well, John, Barnard Castle may prove to be a difficult place for Dominic Cummings. The police found no breaches on 2 of the allegations against him, but they found that Mr Cummings might have breached the regulations by driving to this area. Now, people have been out in Barnard Castle today enjoying themselves. It's been glorious weather. But on April the 12th, when Dominic Cummings took a trip this way, the guidance was rather different. And in early April, Boris Johnson himself urged people to stay home, even if there was fine weather. But Mr Cummings said he drove his family near here because he'd been ill and he was worried about his eyesight before driving back to London. So what have people and the police here made of those claims? The police have finally spoken when Dominic Cummings dashed out of London to the family estate in Durham, a 260-mile journey to be near childcare with his child and wife, who he thought might have COVID. No offence committed, say Durham police. There were allegations Mr Cummings denied that he was seen breaching lockdown in Huffle Woods near Durham on April 19th. Insufficient evidence, say Durham police. And then there was Mr Cummings' trip to Barnard Castle, April 12th. By his own admission, he took his family on a 60-mile drive to see if he could safely drive.
My wife was very worried, particularly given my eyesight had seemed to have been affected by the disease. She did not want to risk a nearly 300-mile drive with our child, given how ill I had been.
On Sunday, Boris Johnson was asked about parallels with Scotland's chief medical officer, who resigned after visiting her second home.
Unlike the lady you mentioned, Mr Cummings actually went into lockdown because he had symptoms, went into self-isolation for 14 days or more.
But after isolating, Dominic Cummings did venture out. Durham police say it might have been a minor breach of the regulations that would have warranted police intervention. Minor because there was no apparent breach of social distancing. Durham constabularies say that had the police stopped Mr Cummings on his drive to Barnard Castle, they would likely have advised him to return to the address in Durham, and they'd have reminded him of the dangers of travelling during this pandemic. And that raises some questions for those who've defended Mr Cummings. If there were no issue whatsoever, then why would the police have likely advised him to turn back? So are they moving on here as the Prime Minister hopes? In this shop, yes, reluctantly. It should be
fined.
Fined?
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen.
No.
So what should we do now?
Move on.
You think?
Yeah.
Elaine and her husband, on Stuart's first day out in 12 weeks, are not. You feel they should draw a line under it?
No.
Nope.
No. I think it needs to be dealt with to set an example. So we've all stuck to the rules to try and keep numbers down, etc., etc., and he's just flouting it in front of us, making a mockery of what we're doing.
And it's unresolved for museum worker Katie. What should happen now?
Well, I think he should have probably resigned, but I don't think that's going to happen.
In the end, it was the sighting of Mr Cummings here that means this row may stick around, despite the police finding no breach in the other alleged infractions. Dominic Cummings said he behaved legally, but when he set off for Barnard Castle, there was no turning back. And had he been stopped by the police, they would likely have told him to do just that.
Well, joining me now from North London is the Shadow Attorney General, Lord Faulkner. Boris Johnson's position remains that Dominic Cummings' behaviour was lawful. What can you draw from what Durham police have said about whether the behaviour was lawful or not?
Well, I mean, it looks, on the basis of what the Durham police have said, that Dominic Cummings has got away with it. I think he unquestionably broke the law. I have not met anybody, lawyer or non-lawyer, who doesn't think he broke the law. The only group of people who think that he didn't was the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Foreign Secretary, the Minister from the Cabinet Office, and the Attorney General. And they all used their position to try to say he hadn't broken the law, and probably because of that, he has got away with it. And it is rather shocking.
I mean, you could say it's fine for a Cabinet Minister to express an opinion about the law. Is there any difference in the Attorney General expressing an opinion about the law?
It's not fine for a Cabinet Minister, let alone the Prime Minister, to express an opinion about whether somebody's broken the criminal law while it's been considered by the authorities. But it's, as you say, it is certainly not okay for the Attorney General, who is responsible for the enforcement of the criminal law, to express a view about whether somebody is guilty or innocent. And the current Attorney General, in effect, on a social media platform, expressed support for Dominic Cummings when there was a question mark over whether he'd committed a criminal offence. And that is breaking with the most basic principles of constitutional propriety as far as the Attorney General is concerned.
But all the opinion polling and, you know, people being stopped in the street by journalists on every TV channel shows that the British public know perfectly well what the law is and what you should and shouldn't do. So ultimately, is there any damage to public health? Should you just move on?
I think huge damage has been done to the sense that the law will be enforced. The purpose of this law was to protect public health. When it suited the executive to push it to one side for one of their own, they used all the firepower they could get, including the Attorney General, to avoid the prosecution of Dominic Cummings. What does that say about their respect for the law? More significantly, maybe in the immediate horizon, is what does it say about people's willingness to comply with the public health messages and the public health law which they've introduced? I think it is rather terrible.
What was your view of the Prime Minister's approach to Laura Kuenssberg's question to the Chief Scientific Advisor and the Chief Medical Officer about Dominic Cummings? Was he right to say that's a political question, it's not for public servants like them?
No, I think his approach was completely wrong. If he's willing to express detailed opinions on the law, why shouldn't the scientists express whether they think the issue about how Dominic Cummings has been treated will affect public health? It smacked of somebody with something to hide because he knew what the scientists would say.
Lord Faulkner, thank you very much.